The more time you spend creating something, you realize how that effort translates into an output that you're proud of.
When did you actually realize that you had an affinity for numbers?
Numbers, at least in my head, always help me sort of give these feelings or emotions a tangible essence. Even if you don't know something and you don't know how it behaves or will behave under different circumstances, you were still good enough to realize that something is there. Waiting for perfection or waiting for 6 Sigma or 9 Sigma, getting 99.9% accuracy or efficiency has a certain cost attached to it.
Success isn't about making the right calls. It's about making them when everything is on the line. Today's guest, Jamali, has built a career doing exactly that. With over 15 years of experience in investment banking, corporate leadership, and technology, he has led billion-dollar deals, turning around struggling companies and shaped industries from inside out.
Information is available to everybody for free. You think he's investing, she's investing, so let me just catch on the bandwagon. That also put the global financial system on steroids, because when all these smart kids came to Wall Street, they realized, mortgage-backed securities is a great product and everybody's making money.
We are at that pivotal moment again. I believe we need to go back to the first principles, right? This is what no one will tell you about the world where numbers, logic, and timing make all the difference. From Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and Jefferies to leading major corporations, including TCS, Haris is going to cover it all in today's episode.
As soon as I started, this is on the cusp of the global financial crisis back in 2008. Again, going into investment banking was an odd time. People were shedding jobs, the world was falling apart. I would still recommend highly to anybody considering that profession is a
Haris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let's start with the very beginning. What was it like growing up? And when did you actually realize that you had an affinity for numbers? And I can see on your t-shirt, math is hard, so is life. Get over it, right?
Yeah.
So,
No, the shirt is there for a certain reason. And if I trace back to my beginnings, originally I'm from Hyderabad and then, moved to Karachi in Sindh. And, I was born and brought up in these two cities, know the roads, know how the cities have changed. Went through 2 schooling systems. So I was in FPS and then KGS. So I have the benefit of a wider, friend circle, social and professional network. And again, my colleagues have done extremely well and I've learned a lot from them. But if I just trace back to my childhood, my mother was instrumental in terms of, getting me a good grounding in numbers as well as art. And I'll tell you how the two really connected later on. But then when I went later on in high school, I think that's where those two sciences really came together, because the more time you spend creating something, and I'm referring to the art side of things, you realize how that effort translates into an output that you're proud of, right? But that was just a visual element, right? You could appreciate the colors, you could appreciate shape. Numbers, at least in my head, always help me sort of give these feelings or emotions a tangible essence. Because as I went later on in life and did calculus, advanced mathematics, you realize that everything can be boiled down into, equations and numbers, and then you can play around with them. And I'm talking well beyond sort of addition and subtraction. And that, I think, really brought together how a creative aspect of life can also be connected to a more numerical one, which most people find mundane. At the same time, both my parents were doctors, government servants, gave their entire careers sort of to civil service. But then again, they also instilled a working culture, great work ethic. I think my father was a general surgeon, so I remember him doing many all-nighters well before at least it was cool for me as an investment banker to be pulling late night sessions at the office. And then as I went through to high school, another spark that came through, probably more from my father's side because he's a great singer, was this bug around music, right? Had my own interests. I'm a huge grunge fan. Used to follow the artists of 90s, sort of 80s. But then as I grew older, I realized, the real gems and the musicians and the bands were before my time, right? And that sort of, kept itching at me in terms of what about, further back in time, what was music like back then, and any science, any art that you look at. I started focusing a lot on the journey, and why we are where we are right now, but where did we come from? And that obviously can give you a good sense of where we're headed. And then with music, it sort of, again, brought another form of expression to my toolkit, right? Gave me a lot of confidence. I wasn't very, confident in terms of speaking in front of people, doing various sort of theatrics or being good in drama. But I do remember in 2003, I got selected for a math camp. It was called a space camp at the time, Burak. And there were a number of really smart kids from my school, but all over the country. And that sort of also cemented my interest in terms of the science elements of not just mathematics, but also around where we are as a species in the world. Because it was a 1 week long program, lots of drills around science experiments, reading materials, games. You had to sort of band together with a few teammates. But there were some very inspiring lectures. Now that I look back, I think well ahead of at least its time, because in Pakistan you had very few avenues of that nature. But they really inspired, philosophical questions about, what is real, what is not. The brain effectively is a series of electrical signals. So whatever's happening around you, is that even happening, right? Is that real, or can somebody simulate that through the right electrical impulses? Which, if you look at the logical equivalency, it's there. So you can, but then you almost start wondering what world you're living in as well. And this was again in my formative years in OA levels. So again, really good timing, I would say, in terms of at least inspiring that question. It inspired me to take on physics, chemistry. I had maths, additional mathematics, all of the sciences that I could scoop up. Later on I did banking, and I'll tell you what got me there. But accounting was always a side gig, but I realized it's probably an important part of your toolkit, so I just gave that as an extra subject. But the core focus was around physics, the natural sciences, and then mathematics. So I think around probably I would say early 2000s is where it all sort of came together as a young student, I would say. Again, no clue where I was going after school, and that I think had many other sort of inputs to it. But at least I was very clear in terms of what I really enjoy, right? And that was numbers, just trying to understand how numbers really give you the power to not just define the world around you, but also what is not around you or what you don't understand. Because if you think about it, even in physics, most of the sort of concept that you have, they always try to account for what we know and what we don't know. Because even if you don't know something and you don't know how it behaves or will behave under different circumstances, you were still good enough to realize that something is there, right? And some of these concepts just became instrumental when I thought about university and what I wanted to do. If I then look at, 2005 is when I finished high school, and the general direction, thankfully, amongst my peers and overall the system I was in was applying abroad, just making the best of things, obviously competing in better circles against sort of better competition, and also just exposing yourself to the outer world, right? I will say that I think prior to 2005, I never left the country. So when I got into LSE and went to the UK, that was the first time I left Pakistan. That was my first sort of long haul flight. Again, very humble beginnings, middle class background, right? You were always fighting for things if you had the drive. And then even when you get something, there's always something more. And I think that I didn't realize during my early years, that mindset, but it became a critical part of my personality later on, that it is an ongoing journey. You just can't afford any breaks. You just can't slow down, because even slowing down these days is essentially akin to moving back, right? So when I think about university applications, again, very numerical decision. The US was around 4 years plus. UK seemed attractive with 3 years, so you kind of get a higher ROI. Had some top schools in mind, but the two offers I had was mechanical engineering at Imperial, and then mathematics and economics at LSE. And again, a part of me was sort of indifferent because I really enjoyed the numerical side. So engineering would have been a solid degree. And even later on in banking, it's not a hurdle. In fact, it's a huge plus. if you are grounded in those, robust sciences. But I thought that mathematics being led at LSE, which is typically an economics institution, was interesting, went through the core curriculum and really liked what they were doing. And so I took my bet, went to LSE, thought I'll be done in 3 years, which is a plus. And then, the rest is history. And it was a great landing. The course was phenomenal in terms of, how it really inspired me to, and many other students that I met on the course, in terms of how powerful mathematics can be. And I'll just give a few examples because we had this course around proofs and theorems. So I keep explaining it to sort of, young founders, people I speak to. And we used to do a lot of mentorship for companies, even while I was in the UK, this course specifically has no numbers. So it's a maths course with no numbers, because all you're doing is writing in simple English or with a lot of complicated sort of notations as to how one equation is equal to another, or you can prove something, or you can disprove something. But the whole essence of that course, and the reason why I realized that they kept the numbers out of it, is because the numbers were a distraction. You were trying to grapple concepts in their entirety, right? For that, all of those notations were sufficient. Then there was obviously an applied maths course as well, where there was nothing but numbers, right? You were just grounded in calculation. There were, courses on vectors, which again inspired you to at least understand that there are multiple dimensions to this world. The standard XY plane is one we're all familiar with, but then we talk about 3D, then we talk about 4D. Back in even high school math, we knew that, the vector equation can also be taken to the nth degree. And a lot of those things really came to life at LSE. And, one of the things that I really now try to visualize, because I believe so strongly in it, is that we as individuals are the sum of all our experiences. So as I narrated, to this point, wherever I was in life, and in 2006, 2007, I brought a unique journey to LSE, the institution as well. The friends I touched, the friends I networked with, the friends who were in my class, and whether I made the effort to diversify and make friends outside. Again, sometimes personality is a constraint, sometimes, you're introverted. But if there's enough of a desire to just learn new things, and I think that at least was there with me, or, to flip it the other way, just that imposter syndrome that, am I good enough, right? Should I know more? Will somebody beat me around the corner in something that I'm trying to do? That sort of at least kept the curiosity alive. And, that when I was studying maths day and night at LSE really gave me a mathematical answer as to how this life can be visualized. So one concept I'm sure you're familiar with is when you look at a line, right, it's a continuous series of points, right? So you can break a line down into an infinite number of points. The line itself, whether it's straight or not, it's a curve, can be boiled down to an equation. What we literally used to do in class and outside of class was to see how different equations interact. What will the addition of two equations look like? Because they were both individual lines. What happens when you add them together? It sounds simplistic, but when you get into sort of, extreme limits, sort of understanding where the limits of a certain equation are, which line it doesn't cross, at least I would see very different things out of that lesson. And in a lot of ways, I thought that, everybody around me are different lines coming through. We're obviously intersecting at this unique point in life. Whether we'll continue, who's to say, right?
Profound, yes.
And then when you realize that intersection, you realize that how limited time is as well, right? If you cross a line and it never comes back, that was the only opportunity that you had to make a difference. And I'll continue on this analogy because there is that essence of, obviously, we're all on a continuous path, right? Time just moves forward. The past is stuck. You can't fret about it. You can only learn lessons from it. What's done is done. You can only do something better today. And also, even if you know where the line is headed, what you do today can have an impact on that journey. I'll link this to probably another nerdy concept around differentials and integration, right? Two very powerful things used to jump out. One is that at any point in time, that science allows you to calculate the rate of change. Whether it's, if it's zero, it's, nothing is happening. If it's positive, it's negative, you know where it's going, right? And then the rate of change was very powerful. Because even in high school, we used to have this class of relative velocity. And again, that just blew my mind as a young sort of student, because I never visualized speed and relative speed in that respect before that class. And I'm sure, you know, the gist of it is that if two trains are moving at the same speed, you'll effectively not know the difference, right? It'll look like you're both standing still. If you're moving in opposite directions, you will effectively add the two speeds together. And that is literally what happens when you're taking a train in London or wherever you are, right? And that just told me that, you know, even standing still is only standing still if other people around you are not moving faster than you. Or maybe they're moving back and then you could be moving forward. So again, why you have to really keep a pulse on what's happening around you, because change is constant, change is inevitable, but change is also relative. So almost forces me to get out of bed, because you can't afford to take a break at times. If you're trying to learn something new, that science is moving on, you know, in leaps and bounds at times. So if you want to stay in, you have to keep up with it. Right? Those things really help me understand the power of numbers, and what they can really bring to the table. And you know, another thing that was very powerful about differential and integration was obviously differential is a much more easier science, even if you look at the history of calculus and how it came about, because that was an easy one to solve and just to figure out the gradient. And interestingly, a side note on this point, a lot of maths is visual, it's artistic, I won't argue. And it was definitely artistic for me, right? So the simple analogy of finding a gradient, there was a mathematical way for it, but you could also just take a ruler and draw a line and measure the slope of that, right? The rise over run. So that was one way. But then when people thought about integration and to see what the surface area underneath this line adds up to, that was a much harder problem to solve. And to this day, the integration questions are significantly harder to solve and require huge amounts of imagination, I would say. These are not mathematicians, right? People solving those things, and people who came up with those concepts, they're artists, right? And that's as high as a praise as one can give them. But one of the things that they did really well was, you know, get to 70, 80% of the answer and then just join the last remaining dots to get to an answer that is just good enough to get the job done, move forward. And in the end, people came up with exact equations as to how every minute sort of that dot in the entire sort of graph can actually be measured. So, you know, when you hear, you know, leaders like Jeff Bezos say, just have 70% of the information and have great conviction and go forward with it, he's just relating to that concept, because in a lot of ways, you know, waiting for perfection or waiting for 6 sigma or 9 sigma, you know, getting 99.9% accuracy or efficiency has a certain cost attached to it. Most of the time, founders and people don't realize, if somebody told you that cost, you will say no. You won't be able to afford it. The business won't be viable. But still, people are in this pursuit of perfection, right? So that, again, was very powerful very early on in my life. And I think as I went through my coursework at LSE, met a lot of different people, did a few internships, you know, the interest in finance sort of came about during my time in London. And I'd say this to everybody I meet, that I did not know what the word investment banking meant until I got to LSE. Just wasn't in the vocabulary, had no clue. I think my cousin used to tell me that actuarial sciences is a great thing. It's coming up. It's very quantitative. That used to, again, inspire me that maybe that's something I'll do. But also when I did a bit of research, it's very insurance centric. So you kind of get boxed into a certain sector. And then eventually the math also becomes mundane. So for me, it was always, I have to be close to numbers, but I also have to keep growing and keep learning something the faster, the better in terms of pace. So, you know, with that said, when I got to LSE, it seemed like everybody just wanted to be a banker. And then we started, me and my friends, you know, together, we started researching that what is this world of finance and what are these guys doing? It definitely seemed like it was a very competitive industry. So that itch was there that, you know, if it's the most competitive thing, I'm at LSE, I have to go for it, right? Why wouldn't I? Why would I pick something else? I was doing mathematics. the normal route for most people who wanted to get a job after university was in finance. And yes, there was a part of me that wanted to continue, like some of my more academic friends who went on to do masters and PhDs. But again, through some other harsh realities, you had to obviously finish your degree and start earning and recouping your investments. Parents made huge sacrifices. I was the first out of my four siblings to go abroad, right? So you're kind of carrying the banner. So you have to continue with that responsibility and not let other people down. I mean, later on, you realize that the drive should eventually be from within, but as a young individual, you're very much, conscious of those responsibilities. And, I wanted to be a great example. And so I applied to investment banks and did an internship in private equity. Again, one thing I'll say about internships, and this was again taught to me by my mentors and fellow bankers, is that it's always good to get exposure to things that you're thinking about, right? Even when you come up with a hypothesis, you have to go down to the ground and test it at some level. And the best thing about internships these days, even if you're focusing on investment banking, you'll hear some horror stories about kids being overworked. It is no doubt a very, very intense environment. But as we were told in our first training session in New York after I joined or started investment banking, at least we're not handling somebody's life on a table, right? I'm not a brain surgeon, or at least I'm not a doctor. The worst thing you can do is probably get a few numbers wrong. So it's not the end of the world. But as we'll come through the global financial crisis, for a lot of people, it did cause huge, huge casualties. But at that point in time, it was a competitive industry. I wanted to get into it, right? The numbers were good. The salaries were well above the average, and there was a certain commitment in terms of time. But then I also thought to myself that that is where I will get the maximum amount of learning. And the internship I did in my penultimate year actually gave me that confidence, because I went into private equity. I went to Dubai, actually. Again, never lived there or worked there. So I got a flavor of both. And I realized this is something I do want to do. And for a lot of people, they do the internship and they realize this is exactly not what they want to do. And I think that both those outcomes are perfectly fine. In fact, the internship is your standard two-way decision, right? Where you can go in, go out, and it's low risk. So for me, at least, that cemented my, resolve that I do want to be in this industry. Again, knew very little about which product, which side I wanted to get into. I just knew that most of the investment banks were American, so I wanted to, get into one of the Wall Street banks. It's interesting that amongst all my applications, I ended up with offers from Merrill Lynch at the time, which is the traditional American bull, now Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank, and Citibank. And again, there weren't many differentiators between the three offers, right? Money was pretty much the same. And interestingly, there was a fourth bank, which I was really keen on, right? And some of you will know or remember the name, but it was Lehman Brothers, where I'd done the best amount of networking. All my cover letters were checked. I thought this is like a done deal, right? Again, obviously didn't know anybody in the UK or in those circles, so I had to do my networking. But I thought this is where I'm going, and I have enough supporters inside and outside, and this will be a breeze, right? Interestingly enough, that's the one response that never came through. And I mean never, right? There was no rejection, there was no follow-up interview, there was nothing. Radio silence. And amongst the three offers, I thought, look, I have to get started. So I went with the traditional bull, joined Merrill Lynch. And as soon as I started, this is on the cusp of the global financial crisis back in 2008. Again, going into investment banking was an odd time. People were shedding jobs. The world was falling apart. My job was my bonus, and that was told many years on by my superiors and by HR. And everybody was just keeping their head down working so that they don't get fired. So that was an interesting journey. But one of the first banks to really go under was Lehman Brothers. And that was a pretty critical turning point, I would say, because that also defined for me that, there is so much I don't know and I might not even want to know. Right? There are things that are beyond our influence, beyond our control. And I wouldn't say always search for the silver lining, but search for the hard lessons and remember who you are in this grand scheme of things, the universe, the planet of 8 billion people, and realize how insignificant you are. Whilst we can be very significant, like I said, we're all straight line or curved line. We are all dots in our own right at any given point in time, right? And hence, you are pretty insignificant if you think about it. So then embrace that as well, because at any given day within 24 hours, you can't control everything. You can't control the geopolitics. You can't control the hurricane, the tornadoes. I will come back to the fact that there are obviously individual action, and actually every individual action has a butterfly effect, but you can't reverse engineer into it. And there, I was obviously thankful to be in a bank that did not go under. We also came very close. Bank of America acquired us. I joined the industrials team within investment banking. A big reason to highlight that was, again, I did not know which part of investment banking I wanted to be in. And again, the reason I share this is for young founders and young entrepreneurs, it is important to know that it's okay to not know something. And in fact, that is exactly where the knowledge gap is. You've identified it. So now you will start to fulfill. And to me, the decision had to be compared one way or the other, right? I had to put logic into it. There was no innate passion that I want to be a telecom banker or I love the mining sector. So I took industrial because they were offering a good rotation system. In every 3 to 6 months, I would jump between different sectors. I thought, look, again, this is good option value, right? I will figure out in 1 to 2 years. The learning is generic. Everybody's applying the same Excel models. And I'll see where the interest peaks or where the job opportunities and rather the deal opportunities are. And so just embarked on that with just a positive mindset. Insane hours. I think if I look back on those 10 years compressed when I did investment banking, 7 years were at Merrill Lynch and then another 3 at Jefferies. It was a compressed or rather a pressure cooker of knowledge. And one of the things that I will still recommend highly to anybody considering that profession is absolutely go into it for the right reasons. Maybe everybody doesn't need 10 years like I did, right? You can probably extract the knowledge in a shorter span of time. And like I said, it is not for everybody. So many people leave after a year or two. But again, as we highlighted then, and it's the same right now, that people don't realize how much freedom and free will they have, right? In a lot of ways, you get boxed into these, I don't know how to put this, but either constructs of society or peer pressure and other things, right? Where you think this is what you have to do. And true liberation is not just being able to buy that freedom back, but it's also within the mind. If you can just realize that I can walk away, of course, it's a risky decision because I leave a nice paycheck back, but then maybe I'll find something that's more fulfilling because clearly this is not. So a lot of people who left banking after a year or two, they're also one of my best, friends, and we're still batchmates from a certain point in time. As I said, we intersected at a certain point, but now they're doing great things. Somebody's, in NGO, somebody's in media, somebody started their own company. So they were definitely boxed there, which was not great for them. They weren't being fulfilled, right? Their passion was somewhere else. And at least they had the willpower to break out of the system. And I will tell you, there are many cases and of people who haven't broken out of that system, right? And you can see the struggle on their face. And at the same time, within banking, I'll just highlight a couple of very critical points, which are at least left a huge impression on my personality and my upbringing. We were always short on time and resources, which is, everything is limited, right? Basic Econ 101. So you are always finding trade-offs or, trade-offs are always there, whether you realize them or not. And at the same time, within banking, time was always short. Deals were always high intensity, high profile, multi-billion-dollar. Chairman needs something, or the board needs something, or the stock price will move if we get this analysis wrong. So we were forced to ask all the critical questions in that compressed time frame. So you have to be very measured with what you need. Input determines the output. Again, very, very competitive in a very transparent manner as an industry. So, one of the early years, I realized that, each time we go for a pitch to a multi-billion-dollar company, we're not the only bank. Clearly on the high street, there are about 8 to 10 just blue chip bulge brackets, right? Probably most are acting on the same amount of information, give or take 5 or 10%, right? That 5 or 10% is where the deal will be won, right? Either the MD has a great relationship, or they have an edge, they know the buyer really well, or they understand the sector really well. But then to get to that 5 to 10%, you can't mess up the other 90, right? If the basic information is wrong, trust me, the CEO on the other side, who is the client, has the grand luxury of viewing 10 different presentations made by the smartest, Ivy Leaguers and MBAs in the world, right? If your numbers are off, or you've done a miscalculation, then anyway, he's got an easy reason to chuck you out of the race, right? So the attention to detail that was drilled in, and eventually I realized initially it was just really, really stressful. That why does it matter? Why does the footnote matter? Forget the comma. Surely this can't be,
End all
the end of the world.
Yeah.
And I realized later on why it matters so much, because it was great in investment banking that each time you weren't just promoted for the sake of it. They would actually tell you what's changing now in terms of your expectations, your career. You've done the analysis. Everybody has that toolkit, but now you're a VP. Or as an associate first, you get trained to manage people downwards. It's a different skill set. As a VP, you start managing downwards and upwards, because then the MD has direct access to you, right? And then you really appreciate that, man, I was lucky to be an analyst. Yes, it was a slog, but I had two people really shielding me. And again, those are the good VPs and directors. You also meet a lot of people who are far from ideal. But as I've, coached myself through life, that people sometimes teach you what to do, and sometimes they teach you what not to do. And both are equally valuable lessons. And there's actually no third option, right? Even indifference puts you in one or the other. And I realized that every interaction, every news item that you see, every corporate chairman, CEO, or a random person on the street that you interact with is there teaching you a lesson, right? Some people can think that it's the universe calling out to you in very different ways. And you have to really remind yourself that is happening, because it's very easy to get sucked out of it, or rather get sucked into it. And you have to pull yourself out of it. It's an out-of-body experience, if I could describe it, right? For me, it's always been that way, that I'm in this room, but to really appreciate what's happening around, I have to sort of pull myself out, sort of float around somewhere in the room and really see how everybody's interacting, including how I am interacting. And those journeys really cemented that connection. I would call it a bond, where I'm, managing my MD upward. It's not just about managing it so he doesn't see when I'm in the office, or I can get away with a few deals, or I can cut corners or grab an extra coffee. I'm part of a chain. The hierarchy is there for a reason. Quality control gets managed. I benefited from it when I was a senior, right? And then I realized that if I have to be an MD, and if the downward chain, again, there's no class system there. There's no shame as to who's where in the chain. There's just a lot of experience and responsibility that comes with where you are in that chain, right? So I realized it is to facilitate the right outcome for the team. We all want to win. We all want to get the deal. This is the way we get there, right? And this is actually the only way, because as I say to every founder, there is all the room for invention and recreation, disruption is always there. Always, always, always there, right? That's literally how the human race moves forward, how we have moved forward to be in this really privileged point in time where, we don't have the trials and tribulations that,
previous generations,
forefathers and, parents and grandparents, as recent as that, had to bear with. So appreciate that journey and where you are at that point, and then make the best of it. So I realized that after 10 years, learned a great deal about the sectors, but also learn how a tight-knit team can work in a short span of time. You can really slice and dice a business. You can learn in terms of what their challenges are, but also learn how you're going to solve them, right? So a very interesting perspective developed during my time in finance. First thing, I went into sector advisory. So the best part about sector advisory was you were there with the clients in good times and bad. Okay. And that was also personally more aligned with my values, right? I didn't want to be in pure, product-focused businesses, wanted to be a little Sharia compliant, if you will, although stuck in a Western system, right? But I always thought just making money, didn't seem right, right? Just capital making more capital, right? There was no essence, there was no tangible trade, there wasn't a product, there wasn't a service. I mean, you can argue there was a service, but that can be massively exploited, and that clearly led to the global financial crisis and many other depressions before that and since. But I learned that you have to be a true advisor. You have to be a trusted friend. You have to be there whether there's a deal or not. You have to guide them through their challenges. You have to guide them through their strategy, and that is where relationships and human relationships are built up. So the analysis has to be insightful, right? Can't be generic. That will build your credibility, and when the time comes, you'll be rewarded, or maybe you won't, you'll fail, and then you'll bounce back again for the next job. So that ongoing nature through a business cycle, I think, developed me in a much better way than had I been in a product team or just doing bonds or equities or a certain financial product, which then, as we were discussing earlier, just pretty much loses its shelf life in terms of at least my interest, and I switch out. I have a very short attention span, and I think that's always been there as a kid. So 1 month was drawing only fighter jets, just nothing but fighter jets, and then the other month was doing portraits, and then doing animals, and then I had to sort of keep on evolving. And I realized that it is a relationship business. I think after 10 years, I'd sort of maxed out my toolkit. I don't want to make it sound like there's no life beyond 10 years in investment banking. Obviously, a lot of my friends went on and are doing really well in that industry. They become MDs. But for me, the shift in that at that junction was very pivotal, because there I had to make the choice that will I just continue to now take the pressure of earning fees and running after deals? That's fair trade-off. But then the learning pretty much plateaus, right? Because as an MD, you're effectively just teaching new things. In fact, you're teaching and training your team constantly. Again, that's a critical part of keeping that cycle going. But I realized at that point that it's not for me. And that's essentially, it's also the time when I got married. So in 2018, started thinking whether I want to continue with this lifestyle, going from airport to airport, always flying around, just being inaccessible, always being tied to your BlackBerry. So I thought I'll do something different and sort of branch out. And at that point, because I'd worked so closely with a lot of sector clients, a part of me really wanted to test myself on the other side of the table. And that was, I think, a turning point that sort of at least nicely wrap up the banking learning, the banking network, the banking career, and start taking your own advice, if you will, right? We give great ideas on one side for acquisition, mergers, IPOs, but what does it take to really deliver that on the ground and take the pressure on, as a CEO, as a shareholder, or even an employee on the front line, right? Because we're all connected. And that's where I started exploring sort of the strategic side of things. And then I think the other point I would highlight on the banking side, one of my MDs very early on just started reminiscing about his early days in banking, because, I hadn't appreciated up until that point as to where I was in the grand scheme of things. And by that, I just mean the era I was born in, the point in time I was working in, the financial crisis, why now, why so, disastrous, why is it mortgage backed this time around when there were so many other reasons, and there can be so many other cracks in the system, what really tipped this off. And, there's a great book by Atif Mian on the House of Debt, which really breaks it down in very simple terms, why that crisis was just 5-6 years in the making, right? And people tended to ignore that. But I digress a little bit, but the MD really highlighted the point that he has essentially done the same journey. Obviously, it's the same industry, the same product. We do M&As, we do IPOs, but he was from a different time, right? So he was an analyst in the 70s, 80s. And the same work I was doing on single clicks, had macros in my Excel model, had macros in my pitch book that made presentation work really easy. We had a print shop within the building that combined all our books. And we had BlackBerries, we were connected, obviously. Luckily, with that generation, which has seen the pre-internet and the post-internet era, and now obviously it's on steroids. But at that point, at least we had also embraced BlackBerries and other things. They were new. Not all my friends had that work, email culture. He highlighted that, just a couple of decades prior, he was an analyst. We were doing the same amount of work, but the best form of analysis was actually getting hold of the actual annual report of the company. And so you had to get a physical copy. These things were not floating around on the internet or were digital. Nobody had gone through them. They weren't sort of ready-made analysis. There were definitely no chat GPTs. And he realized that the person who really edged on or got the deal was the one who actually went page by page to the annual report, highlighted everything, picked out the right numbers, did an analysis that nobody else did. And then incidentally, because he was somewhere in the Chicago office, right? Most of the big offices, the hubs were in New York. In London, we used to just cab books left, right, and center. The MD needs it before they jump on a flight. He gave a very different perspective of that because he said, not only did I draw my own charts, I had to print my own books. I had to bind them myself. I had a service for that when I was doing banking. And then at about 5 p.m. every day, wherever the Chicago office was, everybody would be dashing, all the analysts would be dashing for the nearest FedEx UPS center because that was the cutoff for those books to be shipped to New York the next day. If you missed it, your MD didn't get the books the next day. And at the same time, he said, the flow of information was very slow, right? And that connected the fact that, at that point in time, I was getting everything on a single click. FactSet was there, right? All the analysis, company financials, historics would just be downloadable. And he said, all that's changed is those things have become faster. Information flow is faster, connectivity is faster, but it's faster for everybody. So he actually gave a great insight. He said, nothing's really changed for me when I look at it from my vantage point, because everybody has it on the click of a button. So now the new challenge is, who will react faster on this information, which is available within 2 seconds? Now, if you don't get it in 2 seconds, you're just in minus, right? As I said, it's relative velocity. But if you are getting that in 2 seconds, you've paid for a subscription, how are you using it? So again, you can get information. If you don't use it, it's as good as dead, right? If you don't react faster than others, again, you've lost the edge. So everything is just in constant motion. And, that was one of the many sort of really pivotal highlights or other insights I had from investment banking that also then continued to push me on to do something new. And I think when I look at the corporate side of things, a couple of big decisions came at that point. Again, I'd already decided that I want to be on the corporate side. Otherwise, you just get fixated and sort of, we used to have this analogy that as analysts, if you look at the hours we were working, along with our pay, which was higher than average, you were effectively working minimum wage or lower, right? Because of the sheer hours we were putting in every week. But that said, now that I look back, I also got the same amount of learning, if not more, in that time frame, in those 10 years, right? Being thrown into the role of CEO at the age of 33, I don't think I would have been equipped if I hadn't been blessed with that exposure. Again, the global exposure, and I'll come to the difference between having benchmarks which are local and global and how it pushes you. And if you don't have that benefit, you should do something to get that. And information is now more and more readily available. But that compressed learning, the thought process of approaching it from the mindset of a chairman and a CEO, day one, because that's essentially who you have to speak to. You have to understand their concerns. Yes, at times the mergers were resulting in mass layoffs, redundancies, which are called synergies, ironically. But they are also important for the survival of a business, right? So all of those stakeholders, at least I was able to distinguish that they have ethical stakes in the company and they are all going after their interests. Now, the challenge is the interests are not always aligned and they can't be by definition. So you have to find the right balance, right? But at least it always gave you that insight that what a chairman is always, what is top of their mind. They maybe have 5 other businesses, they're all billions of dollars. They have 2 seconds to take a decision. Again, as Jeff Bezos says, the higher quality managers literally get paid to take 2 or 3 high quality decisions, right? So his job is to just enable them. In fact, the organization's job is to enable them. So I think a lot of those benefits came through because of that compressed learning. And as I'd always learned with art and music as well, the analogy was always very consistent for me, because if you don't put in the hours, whether it's the 10,000 hours from good to great, you always have to put in that input. There are no shortcuts in life, right? Literally, no matter how people try to slice and dice, and there's a quick buck that can be made, or you can join my financial, freedom podcast, and I'll tell you how to make a quick buck. What seems too good to be true usually is, right? So you always have to be, mindful and conscious of those red flags. But being trained in that mindset of thinking like, business owners, leaders, burdening on that all that responsibility, knowing what will really make them excel, a great merger and acquisition, growth strategy, expansion, that just became, second nature. And I think when I moved back to Pakistan, the whole dialogue started from the fact that UPS was a great client of mine, and they were an exclusive partner of TCS at the time. TCS being the largest courier company here, I felt I could add something different, right? Build a new business, get them to enter Pakistan in a big way. So when I came in, the idea was to lead strategy and redefine the business, bring new verticals in. But as I'll explain in a lot of detail, that with most businesses in Pakistan, the foundation, the challenges in the corporate culture, the lack of infrastructure, regulatory support, predictability. I mean, one can go on and on, right? That is a unique headwind that most other countries, obviously there are examples which are much worse than ours, but most other countries have at least solved. And yes, every day it is very disappointing to see that we're still struggling to solve those things. But when I came in with a very positive mindset, we developed a plan top down, right? Looked at all the challenges. Now, the natural outcome was that a lot of the challenges had to be internal, business focused. And I see that struggle with many other companies that I advise today, because it's through no fault of their own. In fact, I still give credit to TCS as the market leader, still doing the best in the industry, right? Best service that you can find, right? Bearing the cost of the infrastructure, no support system, no taxation support, no national transport policy, minus all of that, the family built a business that is still standing after 40 years, right? So that is a testament of something. But at the same time, as I said, the challenges will not go away. So you have to figure out whether you're going to be, taking them head on or just staying at home. And again, both options are there. You just need to pick which one you're up for. So when I joined TCS, again, great entry point because I knew a fair bit about logistics, but I had to really marry the realities of global benchmarks to Pakistan. And then this became, other than the fact that COVID struck a couple of months after I became CEO.
Okay.
So it was a whole different ball game. First gig as CEO, and then 3 months in, the world shuts down, and you're in a mobility business, right? So you can't ask for more. But at the same time, we dealt with that. Great support from the shareholder. The team is phenomenal, stuck together, really persevered for our customers and clients, delivered critical, goods, be it pharmaceutical, banking, pension checks, kept literally the country moving, I would say. So again, there were positives and negatives, but you have to then focus on the fact that there is a problem, you're being paid, or your task or other opportunity is to solve them. So you might as well get on with it. And I find this very, interesting when we talk about leadership. One of the best examples I found in terms of leadership, or how to define leadership, and how it really comes through is, I forget the name of the Jordan Peterson book, where he talks about leadership being the abdication of responsibility. So when somebody leaves something vacant, most likely because the challenge is too hard for them, that is literally the opportunity when somebody can rise in and fill that void. And if you think about it, those are really the only leaders we talk about, we value, we get inspired by, and we remember, right? Nobody remembers a cushy family business that was just transitioned to the next generation and nothing really happened, right? Yes, the numbers and the wealth and the money is great, but that rarely equates to success.
12 rules of life.
Yeah, 12 rules of life. In fact, as we'll come to the correlation of success and money, I'm almost getting to the point in life where I think the correlation is inverse, right? You start off as a naive student thinking it's a direct relationship. More money you have, more successful you are. But as I saw, many a times in the industry that we were working in, we weren't making money for everybody. As bankers in the deals, we were obviously taking a slice away from either the competition or cutting down our own cost, but that was for a greater good, right? So eventually you have to convince yourself that the overall trade-off is the right one to make. And that ethos has also carried me, not just in my professional life, but also personal life. And I think economics, when I did study it in great detail at university, and I had it in OA level as well, was always a science of trade-offs for me. I think there's a big school of thought that puts it down to useless science because it didn't predict the financial crisis, it didn't predict anything. And Nassim Taleb has written brilliant books from Black Swan to Anti-Fragile, where he talks about the fact that economics is just another toolkit because they've just studied historic data to give you a reference model for those potential trade-offs. Yes, it assumes many things or all other things being equal, which never happens in real life. It assumes people are rational, which also rarely happens in real life. But as a mathematician, I always understood that is the only way to boil down and isolate a trade-off, right? Otherwise, you've got infinite variables. So how are you going to draw down a relationship? So economics is a very powerful tool, but only if you know how to use it. And Nassim Taleb, obviously being a trader himself and being in the finance world, struck some very, at least, profound points as far as I was concerned as a young reader, where he talks about the fact that we are, by definition, trained to be optimistic, at least when we're building our models, right? Nobody gets paid, or you won't be in a job much longer if you start predicting the next financial crisis, no matter how right you are, right? So eventually, it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where you show a rosy forecast and you do a great deal on it, and the world falls apart, and you say, look, it wasn't in my control. Now, both those things are true, right? You had certain assumptions that were leading you to that forecast. But as I said earlier, or rather when we talk about, other sciences of physics and, wherever you talk about or you start to define an ecosystem, you need to know what you know and what you don't know. And economics still does a great job at that. And again, because so many theories have come in, that's also an evolving science. You cannot take it at a point in time that this was God-given truth. Maths and some laws of nature, as we'll discuss in more detail, are God-given truths. I strongly believe that. And that is, I think, not just in the professional world or life, you see it all around in nature. When you appreciate art, music, beauty, they all have a certain frequency or a wavelength. There's a magic number, the Fibonacci sequence, and what have you, which can almost boil down the universe into a certain sequence, right? So his insights were also profound for me as a young banker, where sometimes you can just feel defeated that, the global financial system works in a certain way. I'm just a cog in a wheel. What am I going to do? And he explains all of those pieces separately. So he says, obviously, we're taking all of this risk predicated on an optimistic outcome, but that rarely happens, right? So you have to be, mindful of what can go wrong. At the same time, he has this very interesting strand of thought where he said that, we're 8 billion people as a species right now. Obviously, that's starting to grow exponentially over the last few centuries. So again, a drain on resources, many other things. But he also tracked how brilliant minds have gone into certain industries and have shaped them throughout time. And I'm talking not just about the last century. I'm talking about, many years before that. So by that, what I mean is maybe the last couple of decades are most easy to relate to, at least for me as a banker, where he talks about how usually most of the Ivy League graduates and other people were going into, science and technology, into NASA, into space, into other areas where they were obviously clearly coming up with breakthroughs and new technologies, right? But at the same time, when you skew the incentives or the financial incentives the way Wall Street did in the late 80s, 90s, and 2000s, naturally all the talent gravitated towards money, right? And then he really cuts the whole equation down really well, where he says, you've got these really smart people going to Wall Street because that's where the money is, because suddenly, and I think, again, you can look through, obviously that's where the few big sort of dot-com boom and bust came through, and a lot of casualties also happened overall, economically speaking. He correlates that to how so many MBAs and so many, smart people started going into that sector, effectively financializing the same industries that we operate in, right? So if you think about it, a company is always a company. It has revenue, has costs, has a profit, right? Again, input, output. When you suddenly take it public, yes, there are correlations as to what the projections could be. So the stock price typically is a reflection of the future outlook, never the past. Past track record, as he argues, is a good indicator, but obviously it can't guarantee what the future will be, right? Otherwise, everybody would do that prediction mechanically. And again, as I said, everybody would have the same amount of information and that right information. So the stock market trades on emotions. You have a arbitrage or a view, buying and selling. There's a different view. But as CEO of a company as well, I always knew the full reality, right? To the point of 90% accuracy. And then the rest, I knew that this can go wrong, that can go wrong. And I don't even know, being Pakistan, many other things can go wrong. So even as bankers, we used to see that we're trying to look at the company, the performance is solid, but the market is not appreciating it. And that also was always a curiosity for me, that why is that so? Do they not believe in the CEO? Do they not have all the information? And many people don't. And I effectively, over my time as a banker, just realized that the two are absolutely disconnected, right? Something totally different can be happening at the company level, good and bad, and something totally different can be happening at the stock price level. Eventually, for mature company, the two correlate. There's good transparency, there's good disclosure of information, there's compliance, there's ethics. But as we're seeing in some of these tech stocks right now, there's just hype, there's exuberance, there's euphoria, there is actually misinformation, or sometimes there's no information, and this herd mentality, right? You think he's investing, she's investing, so let me just catch on the bandwagon. And that's what he really highlighted, that also put the global financial system on steroids, because when all these smart kids came to Wall Street, they realized, oh, mortgage-backed securities is a great product and everybody's making money. So just forget about tomorrow, definitely forget about 5-10 years from now, as if, we don't have children and future generations to think about. And it became a very myopic short-term trade, right? And the result is in front of us. And, that also got me thinking in terms of how the rate of invention, the rate of true disruption, true creation has completely slowed down. If anything, it's plateaued. And I don't just mean Pakistan, right? Globally as well.
Very insightful.
Because one thing I would really want to encourage founders on, and this can be in any country, is that in this current age of complete information plus misinformation, so you need your own filters to really draw down the essence, is that all the benchmarks and information is available to everybody for free, right? So then you should have no obstacles, in a manner of speaking, to just compare yourself to a startup in San Francisco. And now, thankfully, VCs and through the help of social media and other things, it's happening, right? So never set the bar low in terms of where you can get to, but at the same time, as I said, change is always incremental, and nobody takes leaps and bounds overnight, because even that, every straight line can either be connected as a straight line, or you have a discontinuous journey, which is again a discrete number. So that has its own pitfalls, because obviously, if I visualize a business, it's not like you shut down the business and you open it 7 years later in a brand new state, right? Every day something should be happening for it to be consistent. And interestingly, as I talk about TCS and the company I was leading and how it's been around for 40 plus years, Nassim Taleb also talks about everything that we have around us. We should always be conscious of how old something is, and this applies to people as well. So I used to think that somebody being old will be wiser, will be imparting knowledge, and we should learn from them. But that on its own was not a great yardstick, right? Because I'm sure you'll agree, you can meet all different kinds of people, and just age in itself should not be a barometer for how intelligent you are or what you can do, right? So then I needed another test. So one was this equation that you are the sum of all your experiences. So what really makes you unique, you, myself, anybody else in the room, wherever you are, right? A certain essence that you shouldn't be the smartest person in the room, right? Otherwise, your learning stops. If anything, then it might start regressing, because you start engaging with people who are actually draining energy. But there's a very powerful line in there where he talks about how, if you think about it, the most robust, or rather the greatest inventions, are the ones that have stood the test of time. And a very simple example he throws in there is just your table and a chair, right? So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that will always be the mantra. You have necessity as the mother of all invention. the two things have never been challenged throughout history, right? Inventions, they were happening at an exponential rate in the early part of the last century because of where we were as a human race, right? Sanitation wasn't there, mortality was terrible. Just the health outcomes have transformed exponentially, right? We talk about other forms of population control, this and that, but I always flip the question, or rather the problem, onto the person who's asking the question, right? Just to make them think as well. I used to do this a lot when I was at TCS and at TPL Tracker, because I have no shame in being less smart in the room, because either I'll learn something new or I will teach them something, right? It's a fair trade. So at the same time, I said, if I don't know the problem, you clearly know the problem really well, so why don't you think of a solution? And 9 out of 10 times, you realize that most things that have not been reinvented is because they were already at an optimal space. And that is how you should analyze the journey of any product. Design thinking, that's what it tells you, right? If something does not have that additional room for efficiency, then you're really, no matter how much you try to convince yourself, you're not going to break into it. And again, I'm not talking about small products, enhancements, and all of that thing is incremental. But as we were discussing earlier, if you read history, you'll probably realize very soon enough that most of the things have been done before, right? In fact, most of the entire business cycles and product cycles have been completed and then discarded. So you will end up being the only person who either was unaware and had to reinvent the wheel, if you will, or you could have been smarter about it, have done your research, and then try to move the case forward. So that would always become another litmus test for me, where what you're creating, is it genuinely disrupting something that has stood the test of time? If it has, then 9 out of 10 times, and it's a high bar to meet, but it's the right one, right? Because if you think about it, I think there's a running joke where some of the younger generations now were coming up with this concept that a family can have a phone which is connected with a landline, and how powerful would that be? And from the pre-internet era, it sounds ludicrous, but then it helps me at least realize how I felt about, or rather how my parents felt when we were bringing smartphones into the mix and had this technology of texting and social media just exploded. And you realize that everybody has been living the same 24 hours, and that will continue, but they have a different set of tools that they've been equipped with. Many of them are not having a positive impact, and usually takes a bit of time and data to ground that fact. So the early years are also very, very risky. In fact, those are part of the hype cycle. Same thing is happening with AI, and then happened with crypto, or still happening. But then when you come down to the essence, you realize, this is why this is working, because over a long stretch of time, it stood the test of time. And a great example to even a company like TCS that stood around for 40 years is that experience, that resilience that they had that many others didn't, right? The opportunity was there for everybody. It's an open playing field, right? It's a competitive, private sector market. Many startups blossomed over the last 4 or 5 years. Not many are still around, right? So, I'm not saying TCS was or is doing everything right, but there was that certain inertia or momentum that was carrying them through. And that brings me to this specific jacket I'm wearing, where this is one of my prized possessions because my father handed it down to me, and this is from his teenage era. So at any given point, this will be at least 40 or 50 years old as a piece of fabric. It stood the test of time, and because I'm into sports and buying all sorts of new gear, I've realized over time, thanks to our growth-focused mindset and just increasing and fractionalization of consumption cycles, which has terrible casualties in the ecosystem, this one was made of a certain quality that was actually built to last, because again, it was from a different generation. And now, because you want faster consumption cycles, you are building, or rather building down products so that they get disposed of much faster. And we're living in this inflection point where we want to recycle, but we're building things that genuinely break faster just so that you can make the next upgrade cycle next year and grow your sales, right? And we really, I think, as humanity, really need to find a balance for that. And that is why this really highlights how we have done better things in the past. And the challenge for me has always been to pick out those lessons, whether I was there in real time, which can only happen for the period that I'm alive. The rest, I can literally pick up a book and read history. So history is another thing I would, emphasize to so many people, all the young minds. Just read up. More often than not, you'll find that it's all been done before. It will save you a lot of time. It will save you a lot of heartache, pains, losses, so many other things. But the one caveat to that is, as I said, change is constant and it's relative. So remember what was similar then and what is dissimilar, right? So what is new that has happened? So AI and the toolkit and the potential of AI was not there. So that is then our responsibility as the current generation to make the most of it and go to bat. And this is how I also started seeing different generations, whether it's the ones ahead of me or the ones before. And it's still an evolving hypothesis in my head where I feel every individual has a gravitational center. And if I were to, quantify it or try to put it on a graph, you have your span of time. But I think wherever you interact the most in terms of your learning and exposure and experience, and by all means, it can be lifelong, it can be powerful. You can travel the world. Travel is one of the best ways to learn and grow and connect with different people and get diverse exposures. That defines where you will maximize your impact on the human race. And if I can help you visualize that graph in my head, my gravitational center is, say, at 0. My parents and my grandparents were from a different generation, so they will always bring different experiences. I think in general, when older generation try to jump the ship or try to be too forward-looking or young, they tend to stumble, mainly because they were not born in that era. And I take no shame in the fact that I'm from a certain era. I love my music. I don't understand what my kids are listening to these days. I don't understand, some of the language that they come up with. But then, people were also telling me they are probably the first digitally native generation as well. And their challenges will be very different. So I had the benefit of knowing what it was like to be without the internet, without connectivity. They will not. So their world has probably arguably many more challenges than we could even imagine. We can imagine. So one has to impart wisdom, but appreciate the fact that they will have to lead their own journey, build their own journey. And then if they're not thinking critically, they will definitely stumble along the way. And that's where I, even as a professional leader, I would always inspire people to realize who is closest to the problem, who is suffering from it. They will find the pain point much earlier. We used to find problems, and we were trying to solve problems for the couriers. And this was a bunch of senior managers sitting in a boardroom. Some of them, luckily, as part of TCS of culture, had risen from the ranks, but many others had not. And they were lateral hires, some from banking, right? I was an investment banker. And my path to the solution was always the shortest line from A to B. And I said, why don't we just ask the person who's suffering from this every day, whether it's a loading issue or organizational issue, they don't have visibility across the network. And 9 out of 10 times, you will be surprised that they will already have the answer. You were either, your ego was getting in the way that you didn't want that answer to come through or give somebody else credit. And, Angus Deaton has a great book called The Great Escape, where he talks about how miraculous the healthcare journey has been over the last century. I think anybody who reads that will start just appreciating the whole world we live in today in a totally different light. Public showers weren't a real thing, let alone having, a shower in your own house right now, hot food, all the amenities that we have. We can buy things on e-commerce websites and get them delivered in 10 minutes. I wouldn't even say this is a dream. We're all living like kings, but that's a matter of perspective, right? And I would say, so he obviously talks about the analogy that within healthcare, the cure for cancer could come from anywhere in the world. And obviously there's no guarantee it has to come from Stanford or Harvard, right? So what are we doing to enable that level playing field? So I'm a big believer in equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, right? Because when you do equality of outcome, again, I can prove that mathematically, you kind of just totally mess up the system because you're breaking a lot of fundamental laws. Either creates sort of distrust, you lose credibility, you have nepotism, you have over diversity, as I would argue, right? And it just causes the wrong amount of friction and does not give you the outcomes. So it is very important to bear that in mind. But at the same time, diversity in essence is something that has kept us alive as a human species, right? The book Sapiens and then the sequels were all about that. That as humanity, one of the most interesting analogies I've found through history, and again, this is going many centuries ago, is, I think probably in the 1500s, we were, whatever the population was, it was still a global planet. There were people in every part of the world, but we had just no connectivity. There was no information. So the wars and the skirmishes were just on borders. Somebody would win, they would acquire a piece of land. Nobody would know. It would not make a difference to anybody in the entire world, right? At the same time, if you were in the UK or a certain place in the world and there was no diversity in your population, right, a new bacteria could annihilate half the population. So over time, as we became connected, this was a direct benefit of creating diversity. So, in the human body, your biology, your microorganisms, you find beautiful insights in terms of how the real world should also work. So that connectivity brought a huge positive in terms of enhancing the resilience of the human species as a whole. But at the same time, it also started creating bigger wars, large-scale destruction. Obviously, human nature took hold, might is right. People started, exploiting, colonization started. So that was a huge downside as well. So I think with every new tool, technology, quest for knowledge, one has to be mindful of those two elements. And I think at the same time, you can't obviously control every individual, but you can be very conscious in terms of your immediate action. And whether people admit it or not, you can be sure whether it's having a positive impact or not, right? That at least I've seen throughout my career, the sciences, whatever I've studied, the people I work with, and that has always been a guiding tool in terms of also my own decision making. Because as we've progressed through as a species, I think we're at this point where you need better filters for the information overload. Most of the information is not relevant, not valid. You don't even need it. It's just overburdening you in the same 24 hours that our fathers had and their forefathers, right? In fact, there's a great analogy that in the peasants era when agriculture was the main thing, people used to work 6 months and relax 6 months because again there was not that relative pressure of economics and making money or wage inflation, cost. All of that wasn't there. So life was pretty simple and it was an okay life, right? But now that we've accelerated everything, all of it will not be positive. So we need to find the right balance in terms of how to find that state of flow that optimizes your own well-being, mental health, and then impact on the communities that you're living in. And I think the international benchmarks really help you at least realize that there is another goalpost out there that you should be competing against. But what we cannot forget, and now we've seen that in a weird context of reverse globalization and all the populist mantra, that we're effectively as strong as our communities. And that, again, I would argue was always the case. We were just fooling ourselves in these global supply chains that, with this huge connected ecosystem, we are. But the minute you increase complexity in an ecosystem, the chances of chaos also exponentially increase, right? So I don't know if you're familiar with the law of entropy, but great concept in physics. I always took it to heart, and it gave me some comfort in knowing that as we're moving forward in time, because all the complexities are increasing, disorder will only increase, right? So as we think about reversing climate change and many other seismic decisions and discussions, the world agenda gets set in Davos. All of that is not negative, right? The direction they're taking, it's a culmination of human ingenuity, thinking, challenges. They're all the same. Like I said, if you can solve it better, the world is your oyster, right? In the long run, very few people will be able to stop you, right? But at the same time, you have to realize that within the communities is where you can have the most amount of impact. And because change starts with a single step, if you're going to make a difference here, only then that will snowball, and only that if it stands the test of time. And one thing I would share to conclude this thought process is that, a lot of times where we're so connected that we think we're having some global impact, right? Again, when I boil it down to numbers, that's where the things don't add up, and that's where I find at least my answers, right? Because in a lot of ways, the connectivity is good. It gives you this illusion of having friends all over the world, but as we're pretty quickly realizing that we need meaningful connections, we need sort of, one-to-one conversations, we need, relationships that can stand the test of time and are not based on likes and clicks and subscriptions. And that was the delusion that sort of social media at least put on steroids. And I think it's doing great harm to the young generation, right? And at least we have that perspective of what the world used to be like before this explosion. But the current generation does not and will not unless either they read history or somebody imparts that knowledge or builds the guardrails, right? And at the same time, we should also not be, too overwhelmed by the fact that a few certain centers of the world have given us these products, right? And I'm talking about the West, but now increasingly China, through a very different work ethic and methodology, is yielding similar results. So the benefit of the West was always the talent, the diversity, the way they attracted it, huge infrastructure, pipeline of brilliant minds, other than the one that got diverted to Wall Street and just nearly destroyed the world, right? The rest of them were always out there building real products. And that is what brought us the internet, Google, social media. But at the same time, let's not discount the fact that the individual contribution to that, be it those phenomenal CEOs and leaders, was not as grand or as unparalleled as we'd like to think. These are also human beings. They had the benefit or the luck of being born at a certain point in time in a certain place to a certain family, I would argue, and had a certain journey that put them in that position.
Variables.
Because when you think about, and because I was spent a decade in investment banking, the other thing that really used to jump out was, why the US? What are these centers of capital? Why is dollar the reserve currency? And when we went through the sovereign debt crisis, especially when you look at Greece, right? So again, Pakistan is going through their own journey of IMF reforms again and again. And as any banker will tell you, if you don't restructure and break out of that cycle, debt will never help you grow, right? Because it's a crutch. So crutches are not going to help you break out of that dependency. And in the sovereign debt crisis, a lot of the big banks, and I don't need to name them, made huge amounts of money by completely destroying the economies of those countries, right? So the Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, he's a very contrarian economist, also because I think he's been shaped by those hard-hitting periods in time where he realizes how uneven and how unfair the global economic system is today. I mean, you just need to read a little bit of history on the colonization front, that all of the Western civilizations are built on resource plundering, right? Now we have the new age, obviously, for the energy transition wave, but it's always been about resource. Wars are driven by that. A lot of it is about capital and wealth accumulation. But interestingly, he brings out the point that because of the dollar being a reserve currency, all the capital just cycles through the US, and they always keep a certain cut in it, right? And he's not talking in the explicit sense. He's just talking about the fact that the world is forced to gravitate through those financial, meccas, if you will. And that is also a huge benefit for the companies. And there's reasons why companies want to get listed in New York because of that benefit. Mm-hmm. Now, coming back to that earlier analogy, the companies haven't done anything different. I literally know the nuts and bolts of the profitability I'm analyzing. So what changed? Just the halo effect. So a lot of these big companies, Amazons of the world, they're only in this position because of those, insane amount of fortunate events that just went their way, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously, failure is an orphan and success has many fathers, right? Yeah. The usual saying goes. So obviously, when everything's going right, then even Michael Jordan will tell you that, his successes are probably a tip of the iceberg and the rest are all failure. That's what shaped him. So the founders should always remember and try to extract that real essence as to what made them different, whether it was the curiosity, whether that thought process, yes, they did drop out of college, that was a big move, why did they do that? That lesson is valuable. And then the execution and the work ethic. The rest, I would just say, can happen to anyone. And, that, at least to me also, gives me a lot of comfort, because I know that is the grind or the hustle or the daily work ethic that will define you in the long run, not just waiting for a short-term trade, right? And I think even as a sector banker, that was very powerful for me, because I did not go on the trading side, because it was gambling back then, it's gambling today, right? One of the earliest innovations in human history were around the fact that you had private property. Before that, you had aristocracies. World was a simpler place. It was very, very unequal, right? We talk about wealth inequality being the biggest challenge of our time. Yes, it is. But if you look at history, only the last 4 to 5 decades were probably where this inequality actually reversed for a little bit. Beyond that, it was always the 1 to 2%, a pyramid scheme. You need that structure in society. You need people willing to work for a low wage. Otherwise, how will the business be profitable? And that dynamic has just not changed, right? But that's not to say it cannot change, because I think a huge chunk of how capital formation happens, and now it's happening very differently in this age of technology, is how societies have been constructed and what the underlying ethics are. And unfortunately, more often than not, they have been exploitative for the most part, because eventually, I think it's just human nature. You realize something is limited. I want a bigger piece of it. So I wouldn't say I have all the answers to say that let's just distribute it evenly. That's obviously not the answer, and we've seen that fail time and again on socialism. But you do tend to feel again and again that the answer is somewhere in between. And I feel, as founders and anybody trying to make a difference, you should be trying to work and strive towards that balance, because especially the age we live in right now, this inequality is just compounding for the last 10, 20 years, right? And it's reaching breaking points in many countries right now, be it on points of immigration, reversing diversity. So ironically, people are forgetting time-tested lessons in just this hype of, or this euphoria of protecting our borders or doing something which is nationalistic.
Personal interest, national interest.
Yeah. And so the connectivity you can never run away from. Unfortunately, that is something I don't feel we can constantly reverse unless we just shut down the grid and just stay in our homes. But being aware of the entropy and how the lines are intersecting, I think should be a great guiding light for anybody trying to do anything, across business, life, safety, security, whatever you're trying to work out for you or your family or your country. And I think one other point that really drove home the point that I wanted to move back. So, my decision was, again, based on certain opportunities that were presented at the time. It was fairly mechanical. But one of the other things that, just came up in conversation with my dad when I used to talk to him when he was here, I was working in London, was around how he made a point that I've given the prime years of my life to another country, right? And yes, I have citizenship. There was a certain investment of time and many sacrifices I made to get that, and I respect that and I value that, immensely. But that really did also trigger another nerve where I realized that, oh wow, just because of these financial incentives and relatively things going really bad in Pakistan, is driving so many people away. And yes, they actually, I would say, drain some of the best years. And I can tell you for a fact, I had more energy then than I have now. And the UK got the best of it, right? So that also started a different train of thought for me, where I was like, no, this can't be that, I give my entire life to a different country where I've benefited from, being educated here, being born and brought up here, and I just have to find a bridge, right? Otherwise, I just wouldn't be able to sleep at night.
Wow. To be honest, this is probably one of the conversations where I just did not want to disrupt at all the thought process and the beautiful thought process that you just articulated. How do you keep sane? Because I'm telling you, the level of intellect that you just shared with us, it reminds me of that saying that I came across not so long ago, that loneliness is the price that you pay for the certain complexity of mind.
I'll take that as a compliment, because some of my idols, and I don't have many, are actually all in in music mostly. Art I never followed that much, but one of my favorite singers, if you're familiar with Chris Cornell, Audio Slave, got me into grunge. Like the music first because I think music has this innate ability to just literally strike a chord, right? It taught me discipline. It gave me confidence on stage. I was always very shy in front of people. I still am. I'm terrible at networking. I was terrible at it in university and in banking. One of the reasons why I gravitated away was just purely networking and building relationships for the sake of social interaction was never enough. And it needed to have substance. So I still say, extract, at the risk of sounding a little arrogant, extract the knowledge out of me, that's fine, and then move on because everyone's time is valuable, right? That's the one thing I really learned abroad because people value time there and people do not value time in Pakistan. So simple lesson, should be easy to learn. It's not that easy when you work. And, that was a great culture shock on the corporate side when I moved back as well.
I can imagine. I'm going through that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think when you look at the history of anybody you appreciate, right, and that can be a founder, a businessman, or an artist, I typically find more complex minds with artists and geniuses and scientists. Very few businessmen are geniuses because this business is very simple science, and that's also mathematically proven. But the biggest influences for Chris Cornell were the Beatles and being locked up in his room. There was clearly a very sort of messed up family structure. He was struck with depression back when these things were not very defined, right? So every sort of, twisted genius has gone through that conversion process, right? Diamond in the rough, so if you will. So again, that just proved to me, and I can almost I'm not saying I'm anywhere nearly as good as Chris, as much as I would like to be. So I do try to do cover songs, but it gave me the appreciation for the fact that he had a certain journey at a certain point in time, and then he put in the hours of the work and literally the pain and the sacrifice that gave the voice that now is a marvel for the world. Obviously, he's the late Chris Cornell now, and I was lucky to see him in concert a few times, and it was just one of those experiences that I'll never forget. And the discipline also from those complexities. I think when you become aware of what's around you and how so many things can be dangerous and so many things can't be, or at least how I try to break everything down into numbers, you actually realize how important it is to be rigorous, to be precise. There are no easy answers, right? Music not just taught me discipline, it also taught me my limits, right? I was a singer, so I know where my vocal range stops, and I know when I don't practice, it drops further. Got into distance running in back when I was in London. I never thought I could run longer distances. I play football, but nothing at that point. But once you realize and you start taking step by step, I was at least able to do one marathon in London back in 2015. And you also realize, the body is a living, breathing organism that can be pushed to its limits, but only if you have the drive and you sort of break through that painful comfort zone, or rather, you live on the edge or at that margin.
I think you would really enjoy, if you haven't already, you would really enjoy Dr. Ian McGilchrist's work. He's a neuroscientist, psychologist, psychiatrist, and he would have gotten his training from Edinburgh in the UK and then in Americas as well. And I'm a very big fan of one of his sayings, and that's his obviously lifetime's work, which he summarizes in a very simple form. He goes that there was a divorce that took place about 250 odd years ago.
Right.
And that divorce should have never happened. And that was the divorce between the science and philosophy.
Excellent. Yes.
And then he goes on to say that then we had real knowledge. Today, what we have is information.
Yes.
And we think that that's knowledge when it's not. And that's the basic underlying cause of the meta crisis that this world is facing, or lack of meta awareness or lack of self-awareness.
Yeah.
That no matter how technologically we are going to keep on getting advanced, the satisfaction ratio or the connectivity element is going to keep on going nosedive, right? So he has two books, Matter of Things and Master and His Emissaries. So someone like you with all of those beautiful things. So my brain is just like literally popping left, right, and center right now with so many beautiful things that you touched on, right? But I think what's just really sticking out to me here, right, is you just said two very beautiful concepts. It's the intersections of those lines, right? I think those points are the magical and defining moments of what happens next in not only your life, but the person you're interacting with, if you were to be aware. And then the combination of that intersection can have that powerful impact as well.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So that's one thing was just popping to my mind. And the other thing is that, you mentioned that all of us are the sum of all of our experiences, right? So, you mentioned Fibonacci sequence, right? A lot of people go with the gut, but the gut is, again, all of those experiences. And if you were to just connect the Fibonacci sequence and how it actually can give you the mathematical sort of explanation beyond so many things that we could never really thought, or if you don't go deep enough the way you would have gone in, we would never really understand the depth of it, or how easy it is to be defined by the maths, or the logic can be brought to the surface. So what are your thoughts around that?
So that's a very, very interesting concept. And I think, again, I'll start by a concept that at least I developed during the corporate side of things, because again, you're always trying to, as a CEO, you're always trying to compartmentalize people just to aid that decision making. It's not a reflection on an individual, but you have a short amount of time, big decisions to make, and there has to be a certain process, right? Because once you get into a systematic process and it works, then you'll just be able to do it faster. And I came up with the new 80-20 rule, as I call it, where you would always have the traditional bell curve. You would have the 10% attrition of, literally, I'm talking about people who generally don't want to be in that system, right? As I said earlier, they don't want to do logistics. They might want to do something else. So that's just natural and it's fair. Then there's the 80% workhorse, where they're really good at what they do, again, to varying degrees. But if you want to give them more work or give them more responsibility, they're actually not bothered. They want to be in that steady state. So maybe they've figured out their flow. But at the same time, you have the forward 10%, which is what's driving that organization or the human race forward, right? Fibonacci sequence being one. So you always need people who are living and working on those edge cases. They tend to be not always great leaders, because I think leadership tends to be a different mix. And I'll share why, being a CEO is not all that. And that's why also I wanted to move on and start taking more control of things. But those are the things, the people that you have to appreciate in terms of the ideas that they're really bringing to the table. Everybody has an experience, but somebody does not have the willpower or the desire or the passion to really disrupt, right? Because your disruption or any startup is like banging your head against the wall, and you really have to sacrifice and take a lot of risk, and high risk is high reward. But it's not for everybody. So that is where I think it's important to, again, try to remember the journey, that whatever we know today has been an evolution of centuries, if not more, right? Many, many centuries. So there's a great book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and I picked it up from Mark Zuckerberg's, one of his annual lists, right? So again, always good to read, connect, filter out the right information for yourself.
100%.
It's becoming more and more challenging every day, but it's a matter of survival now. And that really boils down how any basic concept that I'm just quoting casually just came through centuries of consistency, consistency in data recording, data management, passing on ideas, writing papers. There were some concepts that people later on realized, multiple mathematicians had written papers around a similar time. So it was somebody's idea. In fact, that really sparked an interest that, again, no one person will come up with the IP, right? AI is not invented by a certain person. And as we know, it will hopefully be disrupted by, many, many more people to come, right? 100%. Nobody will have a monopoly on it. So technology, one of the best benefits that it has always had was it is the great equalizer, depending on how you use it. But at the same time, it highlights how consistency of recording that information allowed us to upgrade or downgrade our reference models, right? Because if nobody had any consistent data, and if you figured out in physics that something was not what it seemed, then we figured out, around light, whether it's a wave or a particle, and it's both. And then the duality came about. The fact that everything else was, connected and tabulated in a certain way, it made it easy for the academia, or rather that field, to upgrade. And imagine the calamity if that wasn't the case. So the other thing I, would always highlight to people, and any, industry I was working in, that you would get a lot of people who would say, "Oh, this we're doing this great HR initiative or great marketing initiative, right? But boss, this cannot be translated into numbers. It's not going to make a difference on the budget." And my quick response would be, I was like, then definitely don't do it, because I can prove to you mathematically that every action, including you coming in early or late to work and your output, had a quantifiable effect on the company, right? So let's not kid ourselves. And again, now we live in this age where if you can't measure, you can't manage. So if there's no data, then definitely please don't do it. Don't waste your time and my time, right? Because the other thing that's also very clear is we have the same 24 hours. As I said, a lot of things are the same. So with a flood of information, what are you going to do? Will you create new hours in the day? That's not going to happen. So you have to be very, in fact, even more conscious about what you're doing, because of there's so many other things that you're not doing by just implication. So that also really would always keep me on the edge of my seat. I was like, is this the best I can do right now with all the learnings I have? Am I maximizing my contribution to society, to the ecosystem? If I'm not, I will not sit easy. And I used to, impart that to a lot of people. And again, reactions were varied, right? So everybody would not get inspired, but the few that will, they will then go on to discover new things. And another very simple concept is, I think it was in the book Black Box Thinking, where he talks about how something as vague as a theory of relativity has a direct link to the GPS tracking that we have on our phones today, right? And it's the concept of time dilation and how the signals need to be adjusted just to make sure that you are getting the right coordinates. And if you actually do look at the equation, you will understand the power of how a straight line signal would have disastrous implications of, wherever your food rider was trying to get to and everything. You won't just be miles, you'll be like hundreds of kilometers apart, right? And somebody was scientific enough to know those numbers, utilize those tools, and come up with this technology. And yes, definitely, we take a lot for granted because we haven't been through that rigor that earlier generations had to go through. So the Renaissance period came about because not only was the capital behind it, but people had time and had that ethic to really put in to create that artwork. And now we're in this age where I appreciate abstract, I appreciate impressionism, but when people start talking about AI creating art, I was like, then that's a philosophical debate, right? Because that's just a permutation and combination, and I can throw all millions of those at you, and you figure out what art is. But if you take the philosophical definition of art as being a form of expression, that only comes from humans. Computers creating it's handling large swathes of data and churning out outputs. But at this point, it is literally an input versus output debate. So your chatbot agents will become automated. Anything mechanical can be automated, but then that pushes us to be more human, if you will, because you need to figure out what is the essence that kept us going when other technologies were changing. And even AI, people are comparing it to the steam engine. There's obviously risk and there's fear and jobs will be lost, of course, but did you want the steam engine to not come in, or did you not want, the automotive industry to take off the way it did, or planes to be invented? I think the answer would be that, we needed all of those to move forward.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that also helps me think through the implications of our action, and I talked about communities, is also how finance in its core essence tends to be very, very transactional. That's something that never, sat well with me. Even now that I do advisory, I want to engage in the entire life cycle of the business. I'm very confident that I can go down to the front lines and deliver this because I don't just understand the numbers. In fact, I work backwards in terms of actions becoming numbers, right? So, with that mindset, it was always very weird for me, even sitting in my economics class, that you have this concept of externalities and you would always just gloss over it and say, oh yeah, we talk about the ecosystem, we know the trade-offs, but there are these externalities, but we can't calculate them. They're exponential, or they're really vague, or they're difficult because we had to conclude a class, I guess, in 60 minutes, right? But as we are now thinking about climate change and energy transition, for me, it's just the inevitable, because those were the externalities we were just shying away from because they were too difficult to calculate. Probably because there were multiple stakeholders and nobody wanted to take accountability, whether it's the government or the private sector, right? Why would no private business would be viable, right? If you start capturing in the damage you're doing to the environment. So I get that for a business perspective. But at the same time, is that cost not being borne by anyone? That's obviously not the case. In fact, if you live in that community and you're generally polluting it through your business, you're breathing the direct externality from it. So again, when there's skin in the game, and again, Nassim Taleb does a brilliant job of saying how all wars will end if politicians had skin in the game and they had to send sort of their firstborn to the front line, they would never do it, right? So this is exactly where we're standing. Now we're so connected in this ship that's definitely wobbling a little bit, that we have to take collective action, which is nearly impossible. But again, democracy will take its own course and people will rise in their own way. But what are we all doing? We're just trying to now mitigate those costs. First, people are defining it. I find it now really hilarious that we're quantifying the cost of carbon emissions. It's also
carbon credits.
It's also ironic that once the West has completely juiced up the system, you're putting the burden on developing countries. Pakistan is obviously at the receiving end, and eventually people will realize that we're all in it together. And even there, it was just a matter of convenience that you just didn't bother. But now, whole new business models and industries are emerging from 100%. That calculation. And one of the reasons, one of my startups, or rather ventures, is on the electric mobility side, is not just because I understand and appreciate the pain points of mobility in Pakistan and the world, but I have kids now, and one has to think about the impact of your actions today and tomorrow and the day after, till the point you're here, and then you pass on the baton, right, to somebody else. Now, there's one other point from finance that was always really always used to bother me. And this is also a reason why I sort of stayed away from pure financial products. Because making money is just not even a business. I think in many, many centuries ago, it for the right reasons used to be frowned upon, because property, private or public, is also a slippery slope as to where it all started. Because yes, it's good that it's private, so you can do a lot of great things and build businesses. But obviously, everybody didn't get an equal piece of land when they were born, right? 100%. So the system's already skewed there. At the same time, labor was never really a commodity. And sadly, over the last century, it's become a commodity. So hence, people can do these really ruthless calculations that obviously productivity is equal to a certain robot or an AI doing the same work for you, not realizing that the humans started that work, they were still doing that work, and they will continue to do different kinds of work. But within that transition period, you've made it with us or against us, right? So if I have the advantage, I will just screw the next guy just to make a better profit. And one of the things that really put these profit cycles on steroids was the debt in the system, right? Again, no grand internal message around Sharia compliance or other things. Just from a purely financial capital markets model, it never made sense. It still doesn't, because every business is risky by definition, right? And there should be some risk sharing. When you structure something with a fixed return, you've completely skewed the risk sharing mechanism, right? Yes, on the upside, people just highlight the outlier that, look, if this goes up on the upswing and you have a levered trade, boom, you're going to make a killing, right? But most of those trades statistically can be proven go south. And then people lose their houses and savings and whatnot. And interestingly, the information cycle for all of these trades and investments is even more manipulated, right? Because obviously the person with clout and access has information first. They trade on it, they maximize the gains, and when the retail investors start getting in, that's usually the peak of the bubble, and then things go south. So they are left holding the bag. And we've seen this with the tulip bonds, and we've seen these with the war bonds. We've seen this with the East India companies, where everybody was just trying to just make a supernormal return. We had a great term in economics of supernormal profits, which then by definition would get phased out over time because they weren't sustainable. So everybody still, unfortunately, people try to gamble. So, and I think the recent example of what we're seeing with SpaceX is also quite ironic, at least in my books, where I wouldn't argue he's a genius, but there's a savvy businessman, right, who's clearly captured an opportunity that was presented to him, where all they're doing is just bootstrapping a certain product that a country needs, right? So we had NASA, we had the space system, obviously with bureaucracy and other things, and the checks and balances, which are critical for any government system to maintain, it's looking a bit expensive. Great. So some startups going to do it at half the cost, right? How is that a good thing? How is that, sustainable for humanity and then the race, right? How is that not with any side effects? And, if the CEO changes or just passes away, who's going to carry on that institution? With government, you have that inbuilt stability, right? We suffer. I mean, all my government interactions show that they're very slow moving, downright incompetent because of the system that they've come through. So I won't even blame individuals, but you need that check and balance. So now just saying everything can be done with cost stripped away is the traditional private equity model, which is in complete retreat because, again, it was trying to extract a pound of flesh. But you then forego the consequences because either you're not going to be around and you're not conscious enough that you should be planting a tree in whose shade you might never sit in, right? That ethos of the thing is extremely important. I've seen some great mentors in my life, who have that in everything that they do. And these are eventually the philanthropists and the great legacy builders. Everyone can, run after a quick buck, right? So that, again, used to tell me that, okay, none of this is new. When China does it cheaper, it's a bad thing. When, somebody else does it cheaper, it's a good thing. So it's just always a matter of perspective, or rather a matter of convenience. And at the same time, as I come back to the debt influx, and, I have very strong views on the way our credit and fintech cycles are evolving in Pakistan, because I think they're just preying on the vulnerable, and we are a very fragile society. We can't afford these learnings and billion-dollar learnings of the startup world and the redundancies that they create, because actual lives are on the line. We know our minimum wage. Let's try to make a household budget in 30,000 rupees. I think the best minds put together can't do that, right? But millions and millions of people are surviving on that, right? So we lose complete sight of that, and then we just want our fixed return. So two things that were always making me uneasy about this system was that the equity holder is the one that, again, or the startup founder will literally go boom or bust tomorrow if they do something right or wrong. The debt holder will have all the protections and the safety. And what is the debt predicated on? These rosy projections, which, again, the founder is almost, I wouldn't say incentivized. I think if you give the founder the same amount of money at the same cost and say, just be realistic, they might even show you the realistic picture, but they know you'll use that to push down their valuation. But at the same time, you have the audacity, as I say, of borrowing from the future when there is no guarantee in the future. So, some of these things, when they were happening in the finance world, and obviously one of the biggest things of the mortgage-backed crisis was the credit in the system. And now, by the way, the credit has moved from housing to probably credit cards, as we're arguing, and the great wealth inequality debate is reaching its peak. You have everything subscription-based and fractionalized, right? So we've tokenized everything, and I think that's just another form of delusion where people should focus on asset ownership and be living within their means. And this has just given us credit cards in all different directions, if you get the analogy. And that, because in essence it's still just another form of debt, the house of cards will come crashing down at some point.
Wow. It has been a phenomenal conversation, and I think there is a lot that's just, covered, and I think it's like a super masterclass on economics, the future, how the world is shaped, the history, the beautiful combination of arts and science. Just two things I want to comment on before I ask you the last question. Number one, you talked so beautifully about that globalization had its own, benefits that we all, as a human society at large, benefited. But then prior to that, localization, or the tribal view or the community view was very beautiful as well, right? So I think the life is so beautiful in the gray, and if we can just somehow learn from what we knew before, and then learn with the recent learnings, that the moving forward we would need something right somewhere in the middle. And then the second thing, only just recently I had a guest having a conversation with me. They talked about the definition of economics from an Islamic standpoint. Okay, so you said input out, so input, process, output, right? Where the input, you said the resources are scarce, so go out there and grab your chunk of the pie, otherwise someone else is going to take it. And then the input is human resources, or input is the resources, right? Human resources, and the output is the wealth maximization or maximum return for the investors, which is just very beautifully put, that you have set that what you are looking to get in return, right? While from an Islamic standpoint, what he shared, what had a very profound impact on me, right? He said, as a Muslim, you aren't to believe that resources are scarce, because resources are abundant. It's your imagination which is limited, right? So that's the basic core faith of a Muslim. And then those abundant resources are to be used as an input. The process nobody really debates over. The output is human excellence, right? Because if you strive for that, the byproduct of it, because quality do generate, the premium. So the output of it is going to be maximum, returns, and the cycle will be, keep on going. But it'll be done in that holistic manner of the education as we knew, which we just talked about. The science and philosophy coming together. So you brought all of those things so beautifully. You see, the purpose of this effort that we're doing is to bring these kind of thought leadership or stories to the surface, not only for the audience in Pakistan, but on a global scale, to know that there are people, there is an amazing think tank who really has had enough and have the exposure in the world and want to do something meaningful, and are here on the ground doing what needs to be done, right? Because the generations that are coming, are going to be sort of benefiting from the work that is going to take place now. If you were to have a foresight of 15, 20, 25 years. But in that, one thing that keeps me excited, and every day I'm very excited, is because you talked about this, the esteem, when human beings discovered the power of just esteem, right? And we set up these industries. We are at that pivotal moment again. I believe we need to go back to the first principles, right? And understanding those first principles, that how a lot of people don't even have that nonlinear thinking or those experiences, and how the education system is designed and how everything else around us is designed. It's a challenge worthwhile spending my rest of my life anyway, right? So this is what we do. So we believe that in that effort, it's open for everybody, but you will be able to sort of create a group of convicted people who are looking to produce quality. So at this podcast, we say, right, is that for the 3% redefining possible. Right. So the last guest we had, so this is a tradition we have sort of, started just recently. What does it take for one to actually, in terms of the soft core skills I'm talking about, what did it take, or what are the tools that one should have in their toolkit? So the last guest told us that competence, right? And the other thing they talked about was integrity. They said that you must have the competence in terms of knowing what you know, and most importantly, knowing that what you don't know. Right? Will give you the competence, and then integrity, that when no one is watching, what are you doing? So these are the two things. So what are the two tools do you think 3% or someone who actually really wants to do something meaningful should have in their toolkit, which we will be presenting it to the incoming guest?
Interesting. It's obviously challenging to boil it down into two core competencies, but I think that's if I had to narrow my experiences down to two key lessons, I think one that is at least has always kept me going is that curiosity or critical thinking, right? Always question. All right. Just to reaffirm, I keep telling people that even if you reaffirm a certain point, right, that is still a valuable endeavor, right? Because you've recalibrated, you realize that, oh, this thing still works. Because if you stop asking the question, you will not know when it stopped working, right? Whether that's called taking your eye off the ball or getting too complacent, right? There's all these real world analogies. So always be critical, always be thinking, hence, don't get too comfortable in the zone, live on the edge, solve those challenging problems. And again, reading history will give you great perspective on that and actually help a lot, answer a lot of questions. So then you are really, as you said, moving the human race forward. And again, as I said many times before, it doesn't need to be a grand endeavor. You don't need to, discover penicillin, right? There was also the game of odds and the person being committed to the cause. And a lot of times they are just lucky bets. People stumble upon discoveries, right? So I think it's important to be critical and curious, right? Because I think that is essentially what's kept the human race going. And I fully concur with your point that even the economic models, as I said, are evolving, their space is expanding because new technologies really completely upend them, right? And that is also why that science needs to keep evolving. Nobody's figured out the science of money or what the exact velocity of money should be, because sometimes we're on the gold standard, sometimes we're not. We might enter the world of digital assets. So you need to be nimble and resilient in terms of that thought process, right? I think if there's one other skill I want to boil it down to, so, and especially considering the age of information that we're living in and, data-driven decision making, because it's becoming, just widespread. So either you're able to handle it or you will just get bulldozed over, is updating your reference models. And I'll tell you what that means. I think there's a great book called A Thousand Brains, which is essentially, narrating how much we understand about how the human mind works. Interestingly enough, the relevance is directly to artificial intelligence, because all artificial intelligence is trying to do is mimic the human brain. And I strongly believe that perfection is only in the divine, and everything else is a cheap imitation, right? And we, as humans, we love doing cheap imitations. So the more efficiency that you see in the DeepSeek model is because it's holding certain amounts of information of the model that work, and also just solving the edge cases faster. That book actually tells you how the human brain works. And one of the most beautiful concepts that jumped out was this reference model, because human brain is a great, hallmark of connectivity, synapses, how they build up. As a child, I have two young kids, where I'm realizing this is the fastest time where they're building those synapses and those connections. That's why they're learning faster. And sadly enough, as we grow older and at my age, you just don't build those new connections. So that is why I might be sounding like an uncle, but I feel I'm resistant to change because of that. But then I try to revalidate it each time that, is it because of my reference model? So that still works. That's why I'm resisting. So I don't want to resist a new idea, whether it's coming from a rider, from a courier, from my technician installing a tracker, or my son, right? So one should always have that open mind. But the minute you are unable to link it to that reference model, you've lost that connectivity with your own journey, if you can follow that train of thought. Because
beautiful.
The most powerful thing that he or that book brings out is how, just like we're sitting here, 99% of the space around us is figured out. We're self-aware, right? We're not scanning the scenery 360 degrees every 2 seconds. It's just physically impossible. Or the amount of energy it will take is just not possible, or will just be unsustainable. And that is where he talks about, people love using this analogy. We use 2 and 4% of our brain. Obviously, that sounds great as a sound bite, but doesn't mean the rest of the brain is slowing down, right? It's not sleeping. Nor are those reserves that will suddenly unlock and become, 100 times of what Einstein did, right? What is reminding you is that there is a lot of reserve, memory, subconscious, that is the gut intuition that people rely on and actually helps them move faster. So that is experience, value that, but then link it to your reference model. So they talk about how suddenly if a door opens or a light goes off, your brain will instantly go and react to that. And that, by the way, not just from the communities of, the villages and the agrarian societies. This is back to the Stone Ages where it started because that was a survival skill, right? If you didn't have that approach, you would get eaten by the next predator that was on the prowl because you weren't fast enough. So, that evolution, the history just tells you, I think, everything that you need to know. I strongly believe, that, and that reference model, again, now in this age of information is becoming harder and harder to keep still, right? And at the same time, for me at least, I also link ethics and integrity to these elements, because for me, I am always, or have the privilege of being able to visualize where this ecosystem will go, or where the game theory will land up, and what the decision making would be. So almost 10 out of 10 times, anybody who's doing something which shows lack of integrity or something unethical, what the outcome will be. You're just putting a blind eye to it. Or you're turning your eye away from the consequences because you might convince yourself, oh, you're not connected, or it's not your problem. So that's a great place humanity has always brought itself to, that it's not my problem, it's your problem, and now climate change is everybody's problem. So just to conclude, it's that critical thinking and curiosity, and then updating your reference models, because now information is flowing at a much faster rate, so you need the filters on that as well. And trust me, if you're, if you have common sense, I wouldn't say you need to be smart or not smart. If you just have common sense, you essentially know what the outcome will be, whether somebody's watching or not. So then the question should be, are you willing to take down the ecosystem or just grab your pie because of that certain point in time? If yes, then you're obviously hurting the community at large, and you're aware of that. So eventually those things catch up with you or your future generations.
Universe is going to actually get back at you, whether you think it or not. And concluding this, thank you so much for joining us today. With what you just explained, my brain is saying that stay curious and be the lifelong student.
Yes.
And if you have those two competencies as your core, you will set up yourself, up for success. So.
And read history. Don't discount the past. It may not be exactly what the future looks like, but there are infinite hard lessons in there waiting just to be discovered and read up on.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.